personally welcome you to the Fresh Fire Experience, the place of miracles, signs, and wonders, the place where you discover your worth, and your strength, a place where it's okay to enter broken because you'll leave whole, a place where it's okay to walk in confused because you'll leave configured. Fresh Fire is a place where all people matter, a place where people still see dreams and have visions. Fresh Fire is a safe place. Fresh Fire is a sacred space. For God lives here. God dwells here. God moves here in this place. And God is ready to move in you. You've always been enough. You've always had what it takes. And it's brought you to this moment here and now. Are you up for the challenge? Are you ready for your next level? How bad do you want everything that's been promised to you? Look at you. Some of us have been to hell and back, but you're still standing. And the fact that you made it all the way here today, that makes you a survivor. You're outlasting the storm that was intended to outlast you. So please understand that your life hinges on these next few moments. For the next 90 minutes, God wants you to lay aside every weight, everything that was too heavy for you before you walked in, everything in your life that needs direction and clarity. God is about to give it to you right here, right now. So stop your moving now. Still your spirit now. Silence your phone now. And listen for God to speak to you right where you are right now. This is your moment, so don't miss it. I declare that fire will burn in you, that this experience will change you forever, that the light will always shine through you, and your faith will shape you into the best version of you. I sure hope you're ready to receive, because God just met you here. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Fresh Fire. So we just want to welcome everyone today for our sacred sessions. Today we'll be talking about prominent what that looks like. Before we get started and before we introduce the panel, more of like an interview one-on-one, we would like to kind of throw out some announcements. Pastor's currently in the Unmuted series. It's been a blessing to us all. So we have Tuesday night live. So this is our May series that you can catch us on Facebook Live. And so as we continue to do this series, please join and be a part of this with us. Next Sunday, the fourth Sunday, we are excited because not only is it Pentecost Sunday, it's also we will have baptism next Sunday. And we are excited. We are bringing people to Christ, and so we're excited and looking forward to next Sunday to celebrate that as well. And then a reminder that the fifth Sunday is Refresh Sunday, so we will not have in-person worship. It's a time to you take and refresh yourself, but come back with us the first Sunday in June. Amen. Amen. I'm excited. Me and Jose met last year, and quickly was someone that I felt as a peer, a friend, and so he's not a stranger to Fresh Fire because he has done a panel with us already. But for those who may be new to Fresh Fire, can you just give like a brief introduction of who you are, what type of work you do, and like what you are to this field?
Sure. So my name is Jose Morris, LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. I've been in the field now roughly for, I would say, going on 10, 15 years, practicing individually. Right now going on 7 to 8 years. I started my practice recently in 2022 called Titans and Associate Counseling Services, where we focus more on providing wraparound services in the form of individual therapy, targeted case management, and community support associates. Since then, we recently opened a residential treatment program, Kaylin's House of Joy. And so the focus there is to transition and work with teenage girls who were in the cusp of, that didn't get adopted at certain points, and they're on the cusp of becoming adults. And so our job in that place is to function as a transition facility where we try to help them become stable, create that level of stability to where they're either able to live on their own, via independent living, go into a lower level of care, whether that's foster care or being able to return home. These young ladies are probably ages 14 to 18. So, the chances of them being adopted is pretty slim to none once they get to that age. It's almost non-existent. And in addition to that, I still continue to teach at Spalding. This past year, actually, I had the privilege of working specifically with the nursing department because that's one of the things in our curriculum is that they are expecting them to have more exposure to psychotherapy. So I taught a course alongside one of the nurses around just intro to psychotherapy, as well as allow some of the students from the nursing program to come and work as practicum students at the agency. So still moving along. We've actually just absorbed like 4 more properties, houses that we're looking to hopefully transition soon into a residential treatment program, independent living, foster care programs. The idea is to have kind of a continuum of care, right? To where, those folks who, as they progress, they still stay within the agency, creating that familiarity and adding to that stability, but then allowing them to continue to go to a lower level of care to where eventually they can live on their own and live independently and effectively.
So you can see his hands is evolving a lot, and I think that's kind of how we had that mutual respect for one another, kind of doing similar work in in the same field, social work. So I'm always amazed at the work he's doing, because definitely with that population, that work is much needed, and to see that coming into existence is just amazing. So again, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you for having me.
For that. So we're gonna go ahead and get started, right? So this is gonna be less of a panel experience and more of an interview. 2 friends on the stage having a conversation. So please forgive us if we forget y'all out there. I'm just playing. But we will have an opportunity for questions at the end, okay? So, in this field, we often hear the word trauma and phrases like hurt people all the time. And really, a lot of people may not know what that actually means. So today we're going to unpack that. And not only unpack what unaddressed trauma looks like and how to provide trauma-informed care, but also we're going to talk about healing. We can't stay stuck just on the negative things. But yes, we know trauma exists, and we know trauma-informed is important, but also we got to bring in that healing component. So we're going to talk about hope, right? So this is the kind of conversation and how it's going to be wrapped up. It's a conversation about hope and how we can move forward as a community. So for the first question, for people who may hear the phrase trauma-informed care, what does that mean to you, trauma-informed care?
Yeah. So, when you think of trauma-informed care, it's a different approach in how we look at things as clinicians, right? Oftentimes when folks are dealing in trauma, there's always a lot of a sense of shame or guilt. And so what trauma-informed care does is shift that narrative from, what's wrong with you to basically what happened to you and have you been able to survive with that, right? And so, ultimately, I tell people trauma-informed care is acknowledging that, people's emotions, their coping strategies, right, their overall behaviors are impacted by some oppression, some sense of loss, or sometimes even if they're almost close to even death themselves, right? But if you think about it from an Afrocentric standpoint, then it goes a little bit deeper in looking at not only just oppression, but racism, discrimination, right? Systemic oppression. And so the idea of that is to create an environment, right, in a community where people feel safe, being able to go in and talk through those things, right, and without feeling that shame or guilt. That's the most important piece. So I think in a nutshell, that's ultimately what trauma-informed care really means. The biggest part, really, the shame, addressing the shame and the guilt, and being able to feel comfortable with that and talking to people that can, in those spaces where they can feel comfortable and accepted without feeling judged. Because that's oftentimes, I think, one of the biggest concerns that people have is if I say something, then because I'm always in that survival mode, right? I'm in that fight or flight mode. If I say something, then I feel like people will either judge me or they may not agree with that. And oftentimes they tend to correlate, people not listening to them in that moment as being rejected, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree, like with the shame and guilt, because a lot of times when I talk to people who's dealing like with trauma, the first thing is it's that trust piece, and I'm like, I get maybe not talking to your friends or family, because Big Mama like to get on the phone and tell everybody, but for a paid clinician, like we legally bound that we cannot spread what you say in therapy has to be confidential. But because of that mistrust, that's still not good enough for them to sit. They rather not sleep at night, rather deal with insomnia and negative thoughts keep replaying in their head than actually go into a counseling office or Zoom space and really talk about that.
And I do think that that's one of the struggles oftentimes as clinicians is being patient and understanding that safe space is not, you don't get to determine what that safe space looks like. They do, and you move at their pace. And how do you do that? You show up every day consistently, right? Because the loss there, right, almost goes into a defense mechanism of, even as a clinician, if I show up, in their mind, it'll be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that'll be somebody else, and I'll go somewhere else. So you got to give them that reassurance and being patient with them.
Yeah, that's definitely the thing. I think that goes to that Afrocentric component. I'm glad you brought that up. But a lot of times, like the individual I'm talking to, I can't have therapy because that would be thorough, because we have a thorough relationship. So I'm trying to transition them to someone else because since we have that personal relationship, it would be equally bound for me to be that clinician. But definitely if they ever get to that space, it does take that patient, especially if someone coming in with mistrust. Which goes to my second question, which I'm kind of rewording a little bit. It's going to be the same. But first I want to ask, what are some of the common misconceptions about trauma-informed care? And then we will get to that question. But what are some of the most common misconceptions of trauma-informed?
I believe that people think that trauma can only occur in one catastrophic event, right? Lots of times with trauma, man, it can be ongoing, so stress, right? That can be a trigger. If you're always constantly having to think about today and living in today and not able to think ahead, right? That can cause you to start developing access to trauma, and you start to experience and start seeing some of those more we call them like maladaptive behaviors, where they do things that may be the way they cope with it, right? But that it has a negative impact. So whether that's using drugs, whether that's engaging in promiscuous sex, or if that's every time somebody says something to me, I'm ready to knock somebody's head off, right? That's the biggest misconception. I think another misconception is that that we feel like therapy and spirituality can't exist in the same space. And I often tell people, because I work with a lot of clients, particularly clients in foster care, that hold on to spirituality, like the two can coexist, right? It's like sometimes we need a little bit of both. And sometimes starting from a spirituality standpoint for some people is really effective, because that's one of the things often that I hear from a strength-based, a lot of times, that's what kind of get them through some of those most traumatic events.
So we talked about the misconception of trauma-informed care, but how does trauma usually show up in everyday life? Like even for people who may not even know they are experiencing it. Like how you kind of hit on that in that last question with the drinking and those different behaviors, the maladaptive behaviors that is the effect of things. But how does it show up?
And I think, just understanding, man, a big part of it is just having them to be able to obtain some level of stability in their lives. And so, when you look at somebody who may be constantly dealing in trauma, they may always feel like they're on the go. I tell people, like, there's something you hear a lot of times called hypervigilance. And essentially, you know, what that looks like is you're in a fight or flight mode. That means your brain is always activated. Your nervous system is constantly activated. So you're expecting something bad to happen, even if there's nothing that gives you that impression that something's going to go on. Your brain and your body and your nervous system is still activated to put up that guard. So what that looks like, sometimes you may have a hard time being able to sit still. Or I tell people, you know, if you come into a building, you know, the first place that you go, you may sit in the back, right, to your back towards everybody. You may start to look at the different exits and say, okay, if something happens, then I can go ahead. I know I can go out this exit. Or people that come in, you may begin to start sizing them up and saying, okay, well, you know, what about this person, man? They look a little shiesty, and, you know, what happens if this occurs, then what am I going to do, right? So you're always in that attack mode, always in that mode ready to go, right? So that impacts your ability to concentrate, which is a really big one, right? So what does that look like, you know, in terms of, you know, concentration? You know, what I've often found a lot of times is that we tend to live in the past a lot, right? So it's really hard sometimes, I think, when we encounter things to let them go, right? And then we kind of fixate on those things, and then it triggers us to react in certain ways. So that creates a distrust of people. They tend to have a negative view, right? So if you notice if they're talking, it's like when you're talking with them in therapy, it's like nothing works, right? So they often come off like very pessimistic about things. And in certain cases, man, people feel like, you know, when they're experiencing that they were the fault. They were at reason for that, and that they actually deserved that to happen. Yeah. So those are some of the more common ones. So I think if you know, people who kind of often find themselves just constantly in that survival mode, man, I think is what you'll see. But typically those are the things that I see people try to do, you know, using drugs, right, as a way to kind of cope, man, with whatever experiences they're having. Avoid talking about it, right? Even avoid thinking about it sometimes, right? So people may even avoid going certain places. Or let's say if they know that they're going to start talking about things that are uncomfortable, they may start to act out. And it can be one way, it can be being overly aggressive and going off on somebody, or it can be just shutting down, right? Yeah, and you oftentimes, man, people who deal with trauma may start to lose interest, right, in things that they used to enjoy. So they'll say, man, I used to enjoy reading, and I used to enjoy playing the piano, or, you know, some type of musical instrument, but now I just don't have that motivation anymore. So.
And oftentimes we talked about, you know, how symptoms even show up medically for us. With headaches and things we may think that we associate with. I may have some medical conditions, and it may be still into trauma. And I think that's why I talked about kind of that misconception of trauma-informed care, because we have, you know, foster parents, we have teachers, we have just different people who may be dealing or seeing behavior. Person that's just a cashier at the store. And you have this person coming in aggressive, and they don't have anything to do with you. It could just be their trauma showing up before you even get to know who they are. And sometimes we self-impose or bring that of trying to figure out what's happening. And a lot of times when people hear trauma-informed care, sometimes they associate that with something like gentle parenting. And trauma-informed care is not saying it's no accountability to it. It's not saying that we're not working to a common goal, but we are aware that the behaviors that we see is stemming from trauma. And so how we interact and how we respond maybe look different. And so that's why it's important to kind of talk about these things, because when you start to see stuff that you don't really associate that with the person, but it's really realizing. And
I think it's difficult, man, because people often, they struggle to communicate those things, right, appropriately, or have that intimacy with other folks, or just having difficulty, man, just being able to connect with other people and express joy. Parents, a lot of times, man, if you find yourself, you know, raising your kids from a place of fear, right, than peace, then you can be, you know, we have to be careful, because you can pass that trauma down to your child without even knowing it, right? So if you had bad experiences growing up at a certain age, like let's say a mom is pregnant at 15 or 16, and now that their kid is that same age, now they're really on top of them and hovering over them, and honestly it becomes like very controlling, which then causes the issue between them and the child, because in their mind, man, I don't want you to make the same mistake that I made, right? But being able to it's okay to have that and recognize that, right? But create a balance of like, that that's still a kid that still have their own life, and best things that you can do rather than just holding them and trying to keep them away from everything, man, is letting them experience those things, but just doing it in a way that you can provide guidance and oversight and not restrict them from it. So
Yeah, I definitely agree. And granted, I'm not a parent, but I think that's a whole different panel discussion. I was talking to someone the other day, and I was like, you parenting out of trauma, like, I think for every parent, like I said, I'm not a parent. You want your child to have a better life than you did.
yeah,
But what I feel like we are going, as far as a culture, we going to the extreme the other way. Yes, we had some toxicity in growing up with our parents, and a lot of them didn't know better. But it's okay if you can't always show up 100%, and you carrying that weight and feeling like you a bad parent because you don't want your child to feel what you felt, but it's not the same. And so you have to kind of be mindful of how you showing up, because they feel that stress, they feel that pressure, even if you're not saying it. But it is how you showing up. So I'm glad you brought that up. And
I think too, man, it's like I've seen people who are very just numb to just any kind of emotion, like, giving a compliment. They don't, it's just hard for them to accept that, right? It's like sometimes I've even given compliments and people get frustrated, right? But it's like they will tell me, hearing those things, man, either I don't feel anything or it makes me extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Or I tell myself, man, that you don't mean it, that you're just saying that because you have to, right? So, and I also think, man, and that goes back to the misconception, man, of looking at, particularly with African Americans in our community, is looking at things like, because sometimes when you talk to folks of color, it's like, well, I'm not crazy. And it's like, well, if nobody's saying you're crazy, like, that's not a form, like, it's something that you're dealing with right now, but that doesn't make you crazy, doesn't make you weak, right? And I think a lot of times when we tell people, especially I think in our particular culture, just to push through things, right? And almost a lot of times that is seen as like a badge of honor in our community, but realizing, man, that there was a lot of suppression of trauma that had for them to show that, even though they may be hurting really bad inside or dealing with things internally, right? They're often told to feel like, man, like that's something that you shouldn't do, because that's particularly men, right? That's not something that you should do, because that's not what men do. We just get through things and we accept things the way they are. Kind of like what people say about the weather, man. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And so then we find ourselves just kind of normalizing some of that trauma and that pain.
My question for Brother Jose, Dr. Jackson, when we talk about being trauma informed, right? The reality is, for many of us as Black people, so I want to specifically speak to Black people, many of us are showing up before we experience trauma. Many of us, just as a result of how we have evolved and come, and as Black people in America, the reality is trauma just flows through our veins. We are born into a bloodline that is full of trauma. And so when we talk about some common misconceptions, how do we process, how do we navigate being trauma informed, when the reality is some of our trauma wasn't even imposed, it wasn't even self-inflicted, it's what we feel. It is literally the blood that is pumping through our veins is full of trauma. We feel the trauma of our ancestors. I know, even just to add a little bit more context, when we talk about being trauma informed, I've noticed one of the things when we talk about triggers for us, one of the things that's triggering for me, or as it relates to trauma, is I'm always wondering when the other shoe is going to drop, right? So something can be going really, really good, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, how long is it going to be good? When will this shift? When will it change? And I've noticed I have walked that out throughout my life, showing up to jobs, wondering, okay, I got the job, I sealed the deal in the interview, the resume, but when they gonna fire me for being Black? When, like, that's how we show up. And so I wanted to create a space, I guess, if you all could speak to the trauma that many of us were really born into. How do you get rid of what flows through you?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, right? But I do think at times trauma gets passed down from generation inadvertently, and then it becomes normalized to where we don't even see it as trauma or anything. It's just normal, right? Like when you think about domestic abuse or violence, lots of times, man, there's a long line of that behavior that's been handed down from generation to generation to where it looks normal. So there's two things. I think the biggest part, right, is acknowledging it, and that's the hardest part, I think, for people, because again, that shame and that guilt. If I identify this right now and say that, hey, maybe some things from my past experiences has caused me to kind of think this way, right? Then it may mean you have to acknowledge, man, that maybe a part of you is broken. But then with that comes the guilt and the shame. So one thing is, let's acknowledge it first, right? It's almost like a wound, right? In order to treat a wound, you have to actually acknowledge that you have a wound first, right? It's gonna be hard to treat it if you just say, no, it's not there. Yeah, I'm experiencing pain, but it's not because of that. It's fine, right? You got to actually acknowledge that it's there first, right? And then that process of just healing, right? And learning how to handle it, how to deal with it in a different way. Because one of the things I communicate to a lot of my clients is your feelings are always valid, right? You feel sad, angry, mad, happy, like God gave us all those feelings. So those will always be valid, but sometimes our actions aren't. Right, so because I feel sad, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going about it the right way by isolating myself from everybody, right? Or engaging in self-harm, right? Or, I may get angry, but that doesn't necessarily make it okay for me to cuss somebody else out or put my hands on somebody. So in therapy, we look at acknowledging that and then discussing how that's showing up in our lives today. Because a lot of times that's what I will often hear from clients who have been traumatized is like, what good does it do to me talk about my past? It's in the past, which is true, right? But getting them to see it and opening their perspective a little bit more about maybe the reason why we react the way that we do is because of those past experiences, right? So you create that space for them to be able to feel comfortable expressing that to you, but then also helping them and guide them and coach them in a way to where they can learn different ways to cope with it better. But the biggest thing, man, you got to acknowledge it first, because I talk to a lot of folks that are coming that we get from in the foster care system, and that's one of their biggest challenges sometimes, is just even acknowledging. They're showing all the symptoms, everything we just said, the hypervigilance, the difficulty concentrating, the negativity, right? But just acknowledging that that happened to me and that was unfortunate, right? They don't like to do that. So the biggest thing, man, is just acknowledging it, because that's how you break the curse, right? That generational curse. You got to acknowledge it first, right? And then once you acknowledge it and you make changes, then you pass that on to your kids, right? And they pass those on to theirs, and that's how you essentially flip that or break that curse so that it doesn't continuing to get handed down. Somebody in that generation down that line has to recognize it and say, okay, I'm gonna do better. Right, it's the same thing even with single parent house or with absent fathers. It's saying okay, at some point, man, I got to recognize that because that happened to me, that doesn't make it okay for me to do to my kid, and so I'm going to do things different, and then hoping that what I do differently will impact them, and then they will do things differently to where fathers will start being more involved in those things. So it has to start somewhere where that is acknowledged and that somebody's making an active effort to break it too. So,
and so I definitely agree, Jose, with that. It's with the acknowledgement, going back to that Afrocentric, us as a culture, we breed community. So with the acknowledgement piece, is also the awareness of our history. So being aware. I think a lot of signs I began to notice was when I began to read books. And notice okay, as a community, this is why we say our children can't run around, but to the other culture it's fine, but we afraid that the master may come take our kids. So the stuff that was passed, like that trauma, that hyperventure, like you said, it's in our blood. But when we are aware and we acknowledge that, so it's important to know our history. I know that people are upset of what's happening in in our country at this moment, but a part of me is happy about it because you can pull, just like when they pull a prayer from school, you can pull our history from these textbooks that was never in the correct history was never in our textbooks anyway, but we taught each other in the home. The church was where education and all that things was passed to youth, and we allowed government and systems begin to teach our youth what we should have been teaching them anyway. So hopefully this is forcing us to do what we should have been doing and teaching our history to our youth. And when we are aware where these things come from and we can acknowledge that, then we can heal from it as well. But we are community. We have always been community, and that's why the church was so big, because like I said, I'm so afraid because we keep trying to, and it's okay to want to be better than the past generation, but there's some things in that past generation we can't lose sight of. When our grandmothers and them used to hum and rock, that was healing. That was healing in the body. When they were shouting in union in the choir or what, and doing hymns in the church, that was healing for our community. And so for us to really get back to that, we just can't throw everything away. I know people are upset at the church, they upset at family, but we can't lose sight of what carried us through. We definitely can get better. I'm not saying keep the toxicity of what was passed in the generations, but we do have to acknowledge we also need to learn what our history are, and so we can begin to heal, because trauma do pass down through DNA, and how we parent and how we see the world. But we got to go back to the basics a little bit for healing. I'll give you on that TED Talk. See this? So what are some signs that a person or even an organization, because I know you have you home businesses, you doing it big out here, it's operating for survival mode, because you constantly talked about people operating in survival instead of healing. So what do that look like even in organizations? How do that look?
Right. So, if looking at trauma, one of the biggest things, right, is that unhealed trauma, lots of times, man, it teaches us how to protect ourselves and not how to, like, communicate or connect with other people. So oftentimes what I tell folks in a organization, you see things like punitive leadership, right? So everything is about writing people up, right? Getting them, groom them or broom them, get them out of here, right? Yeah. Looking at people as numbers, right? Instead of humans. Or if you notice like a really high turnover rate in those jobs, man, those are strong indications, man, that they may be dealing from a space that's not necessarily that trauma-informed approach. So, absolutely.
Okay. Moving for organizations, if we look at like the unhoused and poverty and unemployment and all these things, community violence, how is this connected to mental health? Because a lot of times people don't connect those thoughts, but they are connected. But how would you say these things or these issues are connected?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, when you some of the things you think about, poverty, housing, right, instability, unemployment, right, that already, what I'm hearing right there is that means to survive, right? So if you're always in that survival mode, right, and you're always in that moment, that means, man, you're always in a state of anxiety and worry, right? So what that may mean is that may make it difficult for you to connect with other people, right, to be able to communicate with other people, to even have the peace, right, to just think about, like, 2 days from now. It puts you always in that crisis mode. And so if you're always in that crisis mode, you're thinking more so what can happen today, short term, right? So then that may indicate at times you may be more likely to do things to get access to means that may make you more likely, man, to commit violence, right? Or more likely, man, to be able to not be able to to be able to get a job but not able to maintain employment, right? Because you find yourself constantly going to other jobs, and then because you don't have the job, right, you don't have the money, so now you're constantly fixated and anxious and worried about money. How do I make money to be able to provide for myself, right? So that's typically what, my experience has been. And even just going back, to your previous question, it's like is that agency, right? Are they always in constant crisis mode? And do they communicate really good when there's changes or when there's things that are going on, or do they just do things and then just kind of maybe tell you lackadaisically, like, or don't communicate it at all, right? So all those things I think oftentimes will go hand in hand. So because lots of times when you look at those things of poverty, housing instability, unemployment, community violence, lots of times from a mental health standpoint, that a lot of that stuff is rooted in trauma. Like when I was working in poverty and housing instability in one case in particular, like that's what we found a lot of times. It was like, man, it's really hard to connect with people there because they're always on the go. Right, it's just like, man, I hear what you're saying, Mr. Jose, but I got to figure out where I'm going to sleep tonight. I got to figure out, man, where I'm going to get my food from tonight. Yeah, I would really like to work through this trauma, but I can't really work through it because what's most important for me right now is that I work with you through processing my anger or my healing, or do I try to go find a place to sleep tonight, right, or find food to put on the table, right, for me and my kids. Yeah. And so I think oftentimes when you're constantly in that survival mode, it makes it hard for you to be able to express yourself and just be able to sit down at one point and just say, okay, let's breathe and let's focus on ourselves. And oftentimes you'll see people, and it's just, because I even think, man, just with work-related stuff, man, I used to think about this, and I would say, man, why is it that every time I take a day out from work, I feel guilty? Even when I would be sick, I would be sick as a dog and would just literally be in my bed like, man, why do I feel so guilty right now about not being at work? Yeah. Knowing that even physically right now I have no business being at work, I still feel guilty. Or let's say if I decided to say, you know what, today, man, I'm gonna go and just buy me some clothes and just start feeling guilty. I often think, man, those are often signs, man, you may be operating from a place of trauma or just that uncertainty and constantly moving. So, yeah.
That's good. Yeah. And I think a lot of times, you talk about it like always on the go, and a lot of times us as society, we like to judge and blame people that it's their fault that they in this circumstance or are dealing with this predicament. But it's that, like you said, that causes like hyperventure, like everything is kind of like a domino effect.
And when you look at today, right, it's like, as social workers and as clinicians, we should be addressing both. Because beyond, like you look at the economy right now, right? Like that's causing probably a lot of undue stress and trauma on people, right? But you have to be able to address those on one end while also working with the people. You can look at from a macro level, right? How do we address like the housing crisis? How do we address unemployment numbers, right? From a macro level, but then on a micro level, being able to work with folks and just helping them kind of process and work through that. So we're actually, I think we're kind of, it's our responsibility, right, and to address both at the same time. So.
Yes, definitely. I always think I blame it on capitalism, but I mean it's kind of just the ongoing, because you constantly got to work to pay bills, but sometimes you're not mentally able or medically able,
right.
But talk to push through.
And just think about like how the price of gas just kind of just skyrocketed overnight. I think we went from like $3 to $5, and it feels like in a month, and it's like I'm just noticing like, man, I'm paying $20, $30 extra a week at the pump. Like, God is good. I'm able to support that, but I'm like, I often think about what about those families that was literally just making enough just to pay that $3.50 of gas. Now they inexplicably now it goes up to $5, right? Now they're put in a position of, man, like, what do I do here, man? Do I feed my kids? Do I put gas in the car so I can get to work, so I can make the money to feed my kids, man? I don't know what to do, right? And so that can in itself can have an impact. So I think by addressing both, right, you kind of essentially close that loop and hopefully address it to where it's more in a proactive way, and we don't always have to feel like we have to be so reactionary to things.
Yeah, like that. We're going to go to healing. What are some healthy ways people can begin to address trauma and prioritizing their mental health? And what does healing look like in real life? We talked about what trauma look like in real life, but what does healing look like?
I would definitely, I think the biggest thing I would always encourage somebody, if you're experiencing those things, man, talk to a therapist, right? Talk to somebody who, I know there's been some discussion about that, there's a lot on social media, but talking to people who are actually licensed, because believe it or not, it is a difference, and we don't get licensed simply for billing. There's a lot that goes in with the licensing part. So, I think it's good, and I tell people all the time, surround yourself with people that tell you what you need to hear and not what you want to hear, right?
Yes.
Because it's like that matters, right? So your community, right? That support group matters. It's like, do you find yourself around people who, if you were about to jump off this ledge, will try to talk you down off the ledge, or they're going to be the ones to be like, yeah, go ahead, man, it's what you should do, right? Working in foster care here recently, just with families, and I thought about this young lady. She has her mother's name saved as trauma. That's literally what she has, and her conversations with her is like, when she's really riled up, she know I can go to her because she'll make me even more upset, and she'll validate what I'm thinking right now and what I'm doing. And I do it, but then it's like, but you're the only one that has to be held accountable for that, right? Not them. And so I would definitely say, man, talk to somebody who's licensed in this field. Get yourself around a community, a support of people, typically that are going through the same things as you, right? Because that normalizes it. It makes you feel comfortable. Like if we're all experiencing trauma, or if we're all experiencing depression or grief, lots of times in those moments, you often just feel like, man, it's just me. That's what I'm doing, and it's only affected me. But when you go in a group, it's good because it does a couple of things. It normalizes it so you don't feel like it's just happening to you, but it's also, it gives you hope in terms of seeing somebody who maybe say, man, I've been coming to this grief group or to this group or trauma group for 6 months, and I was like you, and now look where I'm at, right? And then it also, if you're going through things and you don't necessarily know how to cope, what better way to get it than from your peers who have experienced similar things and can share that with you. Oftentimes, man, I find like, especially in those type of support groups, people tend to listen more to their peers, right, than they even do to the clinician, because it just hits better, because it's like, you're on my level. I don't really feel like it's coming from a different space, like you've actually went through it. The other thing, man, is just making time for yourself. Like I know, man, and I talk a lot about that, especially with my mothers and parents who are great, man. I ask them, man, what are you doing to take care of yourself, right? So, looking at that wellness wheel, are we doing things physically to take care of ourselves? Are we exercising, right? Are we going for a walk? Are we going to the doctor like we should? Right? Are we doing things that address our, spirituality health, our social health, right? A lot of times when I'm working with adults who may be experiencing depression or even some anxiety, those are the things that we focus on, because we know if we're taking care of those things, right, then our stress level tends to come down. If our stress level goes down, then our anxiety goes down. If our anxiety goes down, then we start to see things like our ability to be able to concentrate start to stabilize, our sleep improves, right? And then also, man, I think just our ability to remain calm in situations and just being able to have a conversation rather than just reacting. So, yeah, I think if there's anything else.
Yeah. I know, like, when people, and I'm glad you brought that up, because, that's that holistic thing, because we're not just talking about, like, the mental, the mind, but the whole body. And when people hear the word exercise, a lot of times people are like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. But I'm like, line dancing is exercise. It is healing. So stuff that we enjoy that we don't definitely always connect to it, but it's different things that you can do that don't make it seem so much like a task or something to avoid. But we love the line dance. Every family reunion, somebody out there doing the cha-cha slide or the wobble. But that's exercise. Like you be tired and sweating by the end of the day.
And notice afterwards, man, a lot of times, man, you feel good, right? There's those endorphins, right, that are being released into your body that says, man, this is good. Because sometimes I'll take my clients to go work out, and it may just be going for a walk, and I'll say, man, how do you feel? And a lot of times they say, I feel better, right? Because there's even something physiologically just going on in your body that's releasing those chemicals into your bloodstream and saying, man, this is a good thing, right? And it's a healthy outlet. So I think a big thing, too, is just working on setting boundaries. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I've come across. Folks either have very porous boundaries, meaning they just let any and everybody walk over them, right? Or they have very rigid boundaries, meaning, man, there is no black and white. I mean, it's just everything is seen in black and white. Either it's 100 or 0, right? And both, in their way, it has a negative impact, right? If you think about somebody who has a porous boundaries, man, lots of times, man, they often feel like they're unheard, right? They often feel like, man, that they just kind of get the brunt end of everything. And then when they try to set a boundary, it becomes harder. Why? Because people may start to react in ways that make you feel guilty or feel bad for setting those boundaries. But I often tell my clients and just people in general, like, boundaries are self-respect. It's saying, man, this is my level of self. This is what I'm okay with, and this is what I'm not going to tolerate, right? And that's nothing wrong with that. That's actually healthy, because you just don't want anybody talking to you or doing anything any kind of way, because that may reinforce kind of what you are feeling in those moments, which may lead to increased depression, right? Increased distrust of people. But it's like asking yourself in those moments, how would that have looked, man, if we had firmer boundaries with those people? Maybe they wouldn't be so willing to take advantage of you. But then also with the folks who are rigid, they often find themselves having a hard time having relationships with people because, you know, as they say, like, I heard my cutoff game is strong, right? And it's like, well, sounds normal, right? But they can actually be problematic because you almost like you're trapped. Because I hear people that will say that, they'll be like, well, you know, I think negatively because I'm always used to negative things happening. So that way, if it does happen, I won't be disappointed. And that's a good, you know, I understand, right, that may be a way to look at it. And there's such thing as rationalization as a defense mechanism, but it's like, but you're also trapped because then you rob yourself of other opportunities to meet and connect with some really good people. But it's like I'm trapped in that mode because I have to protect myself, and I really want that. But I also, man, don't want to run that risk of feeling vulnerable, man, because I don't want to get taken advantage of either.
Yeah, I'm glad you broke that down. 'Cause, I mean, I am one of those ones who say my cutoff game is strong, but also, and I think I should explain that more to individuals. I just say it, but also I have went through the process of grief. Like, if I feel like something can be repaired, I definitely can repair it. But also, I'm one of those that understand that if something is not in my best interest, that it's time to let it go.
Yeah.
And sometimes people have difficulty kind of deciphering between that. And I'm glad you brought up the things of boundaries, because that's what I have noticed is sometimes people, I'll put it like this, they have hard time setting boundaries with their family, but have rigid boundaries for everybody else. Mm-hmm. And then the family is the one who's kind of walking in and out, and everybody is getting the blunt of what their family did, or it could be vice versa. So you do have to find that balance. I'm thinking, I just watched the Netflix, The Nemesis, good series. I'm not gonna spoil it, but one of the main characters, that's what happened. He had a rigid boundary with his father, and that impacted how he parented his child, the relationship with his wife, because he was still dealing with trauma from his childhood. So boundaries are good, and that's why you should sit down. Yes, we have supportive friends and family. Typically, those are the ones we call when we are emotional. But when you sit down with a clinician or they typically happen after the events happen, when you have time to kind of talk through with your rational brain. And you can, because, if I'm in the middle of popping off and I call my cousin or my friend, either they're going to bring me up or they're going to bring me down, but I'm still not in rational thought at that moment. But typically you can process and review back with your clinician and talk about this boundary and help kind of be self-aware now of the situation. So it is good to kind of have that professional person who's non-biased, who they don't know your mom, dad, sister, cousin, or none of folks who can have like that non-biased support for you to kind of work through and process that with you. So boundary is definitely important for me.
And I think also to that, adding, the accountability, and I think that's what that therapy allows you to be able to do, because again, there's that shame with that. If I take accountability, there may be some intense shame or guilt that comes with that. So what that may look like, I won't take accountability. I deflect, right? I minimize, I rationalize. I see that a lot. Like, if they decide they want to do something, they can make it make sense in their head and they'll do it. And, but after that, a lot of it, I have a hard time taking accountability. And it may be that they say, man, because I grew up a lot of times, nothing I did was good enough. I was always, critiqued about everything that I did. Or let's say if you grew up, like, that was a conversation I was having with a friend of mine that's also a therapist. Like, the town we grew up in, it was a very judgmental town, right? Yeah. Conservative area, southern part, very close to Tennessee. Small knit, so everybody knew everybody's business, right? And so, whether you didn't have a place to go to, a safe space, because you go to church, you see these same people, right? Yeah. You go to a cookout, or you go to do in a social event, you see these same people, right? To where, you constantly feel like, man, you're always being judged. And so that can create some level of shame as well. And just being able to take accountability because of afraid of what that may look like. If you said, yeah, I did it, man, I own it, I shouldn't have did it, I did it. Like, what would that look like? And sometimes people assume the worst, right, as a protection, and then it out, but they don't realize in that moment that it kind of digs an even deeper hole for yourself, right? Instead of helping you overcome whatever challenges you may be going through.
It's good stuff. Um, I think we kind of already hit that. So I'm going to talk about how can faith communities support mental health without replacing professional care. And I'm glad you brought up, it's a debate online about credentials and what that look like. But I think, especially for people in the mental health field, it is a lot of feelings because I don't think people realize it costs a lot to first get the credentials and to keep them.
Right.
It's not one and done cost associated to that.
Exactly.
And we have to study and keep up with the times. So you talked about kind of, that professional support. And sometimes, and I saw the debate even online about, pastoral counseling. And not saying I'm against it at all because I think it's the spiritual. Like you said, some people's spirituality is the main thing for them. So I definitely think it is needed. But I want you to kind of talk about that. The mental health and the support of the faith community without kind of replacing that professional care as well.
And I think that I often tell people when I work with them is there's other ways you can supplement your support, right? Because especially I think from an Afrocentric standpoint, man, community is really important, right?
Really?
That's why a lot of times you hear what's the proverb, it takes a village, right? We very much believe in that, in creating that space. So when I'm working with somebody who I think has a very strong area in faith, then I encourage them. Have you ever, because even as a therapist, right, I probably won't be able to have that more in-depth conversation with you about spirituality than a pastor can, who's been reading the Word, reading the Bible, right? You may be more willing to take that, their opinion, their perspective when it comes to that spirituality part, right? Because there's also what I've seen a lot of times in those spaces is people they struggle with, how do I strive for perfection in a world that's imperfect? I actually had a client tell me that she's very faith-based, and she was like, I'm really struggling with that because I strive to be perfect, but how do I strive to be perfect in a world where I know there's sin and there's imperfection? And I'm like, that is a really good question, right? And I may not, because I don't have that same training, I may not be able to give you that, but if you're going to church, man, it may be an opportunity for you to maybe set up some counseling, talking with your pastor about these particular questions because they may be better suited to help you navigate that. I also think, man, some of the things you guys are doing now, man, is just partnering with other mental health professionals, right? And creating these spaces within the church to say it's okay to have these conversations, right? Normalizing feelings, right? But also, more importantly, normalizing therapy. Right, teaching people early on, man, how to regulate their emotions, right? Because that's a really big part of folks that I've noticed that deal with trauma. They have a really difficult time regulating how they feel, and so oftentimes it comes out as anger. But I think with the church, creating those spaces, because like you said, they have been a pillar of the community for so long. People inadvertently sometimes just turn to the church for their guidance, just because historically we've always done that, right? And so the church can be extremely effective in that area by creating a safe space, teaming up with mental health professionals, coming from a place of compassion instead of making them feel judged, right? So it's like, what you're going through right now, it's okay. Like, we're not here to judge you, we're here to support you, right? And help you overcome whatever you're experiencing. So yeah, I definitely, I think that's how you start it, because it has to start, right? Yeah. And because, like you said, it's been, years and centuries of just trauma. Like, it can't change. It's not going to happen overnight, right? It has to start. We got to start somewhere. And usually the best place that I've learned how you start is just by having the conversation, but also creating that space where people can have those conversations, where they feel not only that they're but they feel heard and understood, right? So you create that for a space where people feel safe, where they feel heard and they feel validated, then you so to speak, man, you fought half the battle, because a lot of that, it means you're moving in a really good direction. So
thank you for that. This is definitely a co-working or like a holistic care. It's like you wouldn't go to your primary care for everything. They're not gonna, be your eye doctor, your dentist. Like you have different components for everything. And that is, especially for someone in spirituality, pastoral care, our faith community support is supported, and also kind of those mental health spaces as well. They both need it, depending on the individual.
Because anything, I mean, in social work in particular, we look at the whole person, right?
Yes.
And that's what that means, right? So looking at their spiritual wellness, looking at their physical wellness, their social, their emotional, right? Their work environment. We look at all those things because we believe that all of those things collectively together, if balanced and approached right, man, can have a tremendous positive impact on people that we're working with. I would even, even as a licensed clinician, there may be certain things, like I've even referred clients out for EMDR therapy, which is a really, it's a newer approach, but people are finding, man, that they're having a lot of success working with folks with trauma in particular. Or working through DBT skills. So it's like, I was with a young lady yesterday, or not yesterday before, but she was having some extreme feelings of sadness. And, skills, DBT skills would do something that creates the opposite feeling, right? So if you feel really sad, watch something that's happy, watch something that makes you laugh, right? So you get a different feeling in that moment. Or, if you're feeling like you're very anxious, right, doing things that shock the body physically, squeeze cold ice, right? Take a cold shower. Cold showers are actually very good for folks in trauma who are having anxiety attacks or who may lack motivation at times, right? Because there's that layer of depression that comes with that. And so sometimes just learning just teaching those practical skills that sometimes people don't even think about. Like, you mean to tell me if I hold ice, man, that can help? Yeah, because you think about it, man, in terms of it tricks your body, right? It's like you're no longer thinking about whatever it was you were thinking that got you worked up. I'm now thinking about how cold this is in my hands, right? Or if I take a shot of hot sauce, right, I'm thinking about how hot this is. Or if I submerge myself in ice cold water, I'm thinking about how cold this water is. So I'm no longer thinking about whatever that was going to have me go into an anxiety attack. So
I love EMDR, but yeah.
If you're sad, to do the opposite of being sad. But the lesson that they gave her was to keep doing your sad stuff. Lay in it. If it's raining, go lay outside. And I'm looking at the therapist like, lady, what the heck are you talking about? So I'm glad you said that. I wish that there were more therapists out there that look like us, that could give that perspective. So how do we connect people like us with therapists like us without, I know I've asked over and over and over, but it's limited.
And that's something that's really important because it is a limited space, right? And that was, and I think I didn't touch on that earlier, but that's one of the things, man, I think that the church can be very integral in doing is making those folks available and giving you those resources, because oftentimes that's where folks like us look like, that's where we're going to go to first. But I would also encourage you too, is just like you have to look at them like your client has certain rights, like just the same if they're going to a medical doctor. If you have particular questions or concerns, please speak up. Don't feel like that just because, well, they're the licensed therapist and I don't agree with this, that I can't necessarily say anything. No, if anything, you should, because at the end of the day, the therapist is only spending, an hour with them a week, but you're the one that's having to be with them all the time. So that should be more of a collaborative thing to where if you have particular questions about like, hey, why are we doing this? And I don't think that that's been very helpful, then that should be some feedback they should be open to. And honestly, if they're not open to it, then that's when you may want to reevaluate that relationship and look to get them in somewhere else.
Yeah.
But definitely feel that we want you to feel that a effective therapist wants the family involved, right?
Yes.
They see they should be able to recognize it and say, yeah, you know this person better than I do, and you're going to have more of an influence. So it is very important that I work with you. I almost make that's almost mandatory for me. If I'm working with a kid, we have to do family therapy at least once a month, once or twice a month, even if it's not mandated or in the school. I have to, because I can only do so much. You're the one that's going to have to be able to implement these things and respond to them and encourage these things. So
that's good information as well, because I feel like a lot of the techniques have created more hostility in my home when it comes to raising my child, because I'm like, you told her to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm on the outside looking like, let's be realistic. Do you really want to go outside in the middle of winter while it's raining? Come on now.
Yeah, right.
Who's going to do that?
And let me have they introduced family sessions?
No.
That should be something. Then you should request that as a
I've
client.
sat in on a couple, but I feel like therapy is her time.
Yeah.
I don't want to encroach on that.
Yeah.
But again, she's kind of leading the therapist. I feel like at certain times, because why would you want to keep being in this depressive state with more depressive music? Like you are, I can tell all the time, you are making it worse. Like if I'm sad, I'm not going to keep listening to Rod Wave or whatever she listens to. I'm going to do the opposite. Like I need to go in. Like I was still agreed when I came in today. Like I ain't had a good worship, so when the music's going, I'm in my zone. Can't really do that with a kid because they don't quite understand.
And that would be, to me, if they're effective therapists, what you're showing is very valuable feedback of what they're doing is not working, right? Because if you don't speak up, then they're just going to keep doing it. Yeah. But if you tell them like, hey, I don't think this is working, can you help me understand why, when they're experiencing these really intense feelings, why are we, instead of focusing on in that moment, because sometimes those intense feelings can lead to self-harm or maybe even some suicidal thoughts or attempts. And it's like, well, I don't see this working. Can maybe you explain to me why we're taking this approach and what we're hoping to get from this? Because I'm gonna be honest, what I see, man, is I feel like it's getting worse. So can you help me with that? And I think approach it that way. And I think too, as the parent, I really think it would be beneficial if we start having some family sessions too. Yeah. What do you think about that? And if they're an honest therapist, they may say, hey, I don't have a lot of experience in that. Okay, well, can you refer me to somebody else that can, right? And then take that route. Or they should say, yeah, by all means, let's do that. But But I would like to have an answer for you, man, in terms of just like the space for us. It is limited. I can probably count on one hand how many in the state of Kentucky, how many black male LCSWs we have. I only know now, if you're interested in that, I have plenty. I know people, but that's only through connection and social, like interacting with people like outside of work and then getting their information. And because there's times when, I may say, hey, I'm not the one that's best suited for you, but I know this person at this agency, man, that would do really well with you. Yeah. So. But you do though, right? And that's something they should welcome. You should be able to go in there and say, this is what I want. Oftentimes I will ask families the same question. I start out all my sessions, I said, man, if I had a magic wand and I could make one thing better for you from therapy, what would that be? That should be one of the first questions because that will give me a sense of direction and purpose, right? So I know that I'm staying in alignment with what you want and also what the client wants as well. Yeah. So. Yeah. Let's talk afterwards. I got some people I think that'll work good. Yeah.
2 questions that I'm not sure if they even correlate, so just go with me while I'm processing this in real time. So I was thinking about this when Byron was talking about his child, but the reality is many of us are adult children. And what I mean by that is there are times where we are feeling a thing, but the reality is we just don't even have the words to articulate it.
Yeah.
I'm a grown man of a certain age, and I still remember this about 2 years ago, meeting with a therapist, and the question was asked. In fact, they had kind of showed it was like a ideogram and just a whole bunch of verbs. And it was like, hey, from the whole spectrum and all in the middle. And the question was like, how do you feel? I could not identify a word to articulate what I felt. That's a big deal. To feel something, to be reacting to something and not be able to name what you feel, to not be able to articulate what that feeling is. We can name rage, rage. We can name anger, anger. We can call happiness, happiness. But how do you articulate what you feel, maybe when you aren't even understanding what it is that you're feeling? That's the first thing. My second question is this: when we talk about faith in communities, where we talk about being able to name something, the danger when we talk about professional care in faith communities, for me, is not only just the lack of education, but even the inconsistency in what we will call a thing. Here is what I mean. You can walk into a clinical space, and a clinical space will respond to however you are feeling by calling it depression. You walk into a sacred space and you articulate those same words, they will not call it depression, they will call it the devil. And so how do you, when we talk about faith communities and supporting professional care, one, when I'm struggling with what to name what I'm feeling, and then two, when I'm naming what I'm feeling, I'm getting two very different answers from two very different communities. I show up to your office and you saying, no, brother, you are clinically depressed. I go to my pastor saying, no, brother, that ain't nothing but the clinical devil. We need to pray that thing off of you.
Yeah.
And so how do we, when we talk about this marrying of faith communities supporting mental health professional care, I don't want to kind of go on a tangent here, but I know probably all of us in this room at some point have even been exposed to Christians that will tell you, hey, name it and claim it and pray about it and leave it there. Leave it there. You don't need to go see nobody. That ain't nothing but the devil. We're gonna pray that thing off of you. We're gonna have a little prayer circle. We're gonna tear it. We're gonna wait on the Lord until you throw it up and you get delivered, and we're gonna move on. When the reality is that's just not realistic. That's just not practical.
Right.
That's just not true.
Right. No, you actually hit a couple of things there. So I'll touch on the first question that you brought up in terms of feelings, and I often see that a lot of times in particular, and I've noticed it with black men in particular. I'll say when they'll talk, and I was like, well, how did it make you feel? And then they just pause, and it's like they can't even tell you how it made. They know how they react to it, right? And you can even, but I think in those moments when that happens, I tend to try to know, like, it's okay. That's one of the things we're gonna work on. And it also gives me an idea of the clinician, kind of where we're at too, right? It's saying like, you may not know, right, how you feel, but right now that may be where I meet you at, because as a therapist, that should be my job. I meet the client where they're at, right? And so start out through educating, right? These are, whether if you want to make it very basic and say, angry, happy, sad, right? But then I think what you touched on, and it makes sense, because it is true. We're often we equate everything to anger. Right? I did it because I was angry. I reacted this way because I was angry. I said what I said out of anger, right? But there's something that we talk about in therapy called that primary emotion, right? Lots of times anger is secondary, right? But oftentimes those primary emotions are embarrassment, feelings of hurt, right? Neglect, rejection, right? So those are the underlying, you just express it in anger. One way is just to acknowledge that, and sometimes I think, particularly with men, and this is, I think, across, regardless of color, it's like we're taught, man, in that sense that it's not okay to feel that, so we don't talk about it. And then we grow up, and then like you said, you have grown men who may be well off in terms of financially, independent-wise, but just emotionally may still be operating from a space of a child, because they haven't really been in an environment where they were allowed to let that grow. Because lots of times what I found in those spaces is if I asked them, they would tell me, man, they didn't talk about feelings growing up. When somebody passed away, when I experienced certain things, we didn't talk about it. And there was actually times, Mr. Jose, where I remember expressing how I felt, and I got a whooping for it, right? Or I got punished for it, right? So that we don't realize, in that sense, like we're basically telling you don't have feelings. Yeah. It's wrong for you to experience those feelings. So I think in terms of therapy, a therapist should be able to help you unpack that and say, like, now you may be reacting angrily, right? But if we're being honest, and this is where the part where we have to be honest with ourselves and work through that shame, is, was there other feelings that were going on? Like, what did we feel immediately? Because sometimes that anger is just like, I felt sad, I felt rejected, or I felt embarrassed, but then it turned into anger by me putting my hands on you, cussing you out at school, walking out the class, self-harming, whatever that can be, right? But what was that underlying, right? And helping unpack that. The other part, right, is I think, and I can't stress this enough, is just through education, right? It's just, I think the more that, in the spiritual realm, we continue to create those spaces, right? And the more people become more educated about like how to approach like those certain conversations, I think is where we start to where pastors start to maybe realize like that, is there a different way we can say that it's the devil without attaching that shame to it? Because that chance not 10, if you're telling somebody that's just the devil, there's going to be some shame with that, right? And I often tell people, when I work with them in sessions, and I say I'm not far from a pastor, but I tell them, because that's the whole point of therapy. Sometimes we tend to see things through our own personal lens. And so when we do that, it makes it harder for us to be able to see the bigger picture, see other people's perspective, or just be open to another perspective, right? And it was like, would you be willing, when you hear the term wait for the Lord, what if that word wait was an actual verb, right? Like envision like if you were a waitress or a waiter, right? What does a waitress or a waiter does? They wait, but they come, they make sure you got everything you need so that you can get what you need, right? So that's the same thing with God. It's like if you're going to wait on the Lord or wait on God, it's like, okay, God, I hear you. I'm going to do these things. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make sure I do this. Like, what else you need me to do, God? I'm here to wait on you, right? To make sure I can get what I need. And so I think, man, that when you start to word it in that way, man, it shifts more towards the accountability and the empowerment, right? Because we could probably look through the book and talk a lot of times about Jesus and how Jesus was a man of action. Like he just didn't just pray, right? He prayed. That was an important part of it, but he was also a man of action. And so that's the part too, I think, how we can, from a therapeutic standpoint and a spiritual standpoint, is it's okay to pray, but don't let it create. And a friend who is a therapist who worked, I think she did some work in ministry, was like, how do we pray but also action? Because sometimes prayer can create this kind of, she called it spiritual paralysis, right? To where we feel like, we tell people if you just pray, it just get better on its own. But in a sense, from a clinical standpoint, that still means you're deflecting some of that accountability, because you have to be able to hold yourself accountable, because God's still going to expect you to hold you accountable. Like if you're praying to him, he's going to expect you not to do the things that you were doing before, right? It just doesn't just magically just go away. So I think the more you guys are creating those spaces to have those conversations, it reduces those stigmas, right? And saying that the two can coexist and they're not in competition with one another. Right, that's not what therapy aims to do, and that's not what spirituality aims to do. Is how do we create that they exist in those spaces? And I think now what you guys are doing is excellent by just having those conversations and just bringing mental health clinicians in the church community to be able to have those talks with people.
Because I think a lot of that is also like spiritual bypassing. But I also like to relate that to medical, right? So someone to come to us and say they have high blood pressure, we're going to tell them to pray, but also take their medication. It's only when it's mental health. So I think like we have to equate that. Like if somebody had high blood pressure or they had diabetes, like we're going to pray for them. We're going to pray for deliverance. If they had cancer, we ain't going to tell them, don't go to radiation. Right. We're going to pray for deliverance, but we also going to ask them to seek treatment. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing for mental health. Like, yes, we're going to pray. We're going to do all those things, but if you need meds, management, we're going to ask you to take your meds. If you go into therapy, we're going to tell you to go to therapy. Like, it's all in the compass. So I think the more we begin to relate mental health with medical, because the mind is the health of the mind, then that's the better space we can be in.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Cause people, making that correlation, I think is really good, because I often ask my students a lot of times, why are people so quick to go to the doctor but avoiding mental health, right? Because I go here, they give me a pill and I'm better, right? But with therapy, man, it's going to require work,
yes.
Right? It means you got to be. It's not going to be just a pill, right? It means you have to show up every day for yourself, right? That means you have to look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, man, I'm not perfect, and that's okay, because no one is, and there's no shame in that, but what can I do today going forward, right, to improve my situation or improve myself so that way my situations can be better. I even do the, what's within our control, what's out of our control, right? Mm-hmm. And where do you think your energy is going to be more vested in and more effective in, focusing on things that are within your control, right, or things that are out of your control? Pretty easy to go things within my control, right? So.
I feel more shame going to the doctor because they ask me why you ain't exercising, why you ain't eating right. I feel better going to the doctor. But anyway, I feel more shame, guilt in the medical office.
Well, and that's the thing too. A lot of times, when you think about mental, man, that can start to affect your physical, right? I mean, 'cause that's all anxiety attack is, man. You have literally fixated over something to the point, man, it starts to affect your heart rate and everything else that's experienced. It starts to literally have a physical impact on your body. Sleep paralysis. I see a lot of folks who deal with trauma. It's like sleep paralysis, man, can be a big trigger. Well, but if you're going to bed worried about, man, I hope I don't go tonight and have another sleep paralysis, and you just fixated, you actually can trigger yourself into having sleep paralysis in that moment. So it just shows you, man, just how powerful the mind can be if you actually apply it. That's where we get the placebo effect from, right? It's like people literally convince themselves by taking this, I'm not experiencing any more pain.
Yeah.
And it's a sugar pill. But your mind convinced you, man, you're not experiencing that anymore. That shows you your mind can be really powerful if you use it. So
I'm going to deviate a little bit from the current conversation, but it's still geared around trauma. And I want to just comment on, for me, I believe in prayer, but I also believe that faith without works is dead. So, I pray about something. Sometimes God brings it to me, but, it's just like if you're sick, I'm going to pray that I get better. But if I don't go to the doctor for him to diagnose me, find out what's going on, and hopefully make a good diagnosis and prescribe medication or treatment or whatever that may be, then I can't be upset and say that God didn't answer my prayer. I think that we have to be proactive in our faith as well. But could you speak a little bit? Okay, so I work in public health. I don't have any credentials as far as a therapist is concerned, social work, or anything. But I have lived experience, and so I work with individuals that are unhoused. I work with individuals that suffers from substance use disorder, individuals that have hepatitis C, HIV, just that whole spectrum. And from having the lived experience, I often find in trying to have conversations and trying to navigate through and find ways to help them that I become triggered from my own trauma. And oftentimes, I don't know how to deal with my feelings. I'm either going to try everything I can till I make myself almost emotionally sick, because you're working against a system that's not for the marginalized community anyway. And so I find myself getting into compassion burnout real quick, or either I shut down or I become depressed. Could you speak to a little bit about how would you manage as the person working with people?
No, I think that's really important as well. I mean, that's a good question, because I often hear that a lot of times, or sometimes I can pick up on it when just like as a supervisor and seeing my staff that oftentimes they can be triggered without even realizing it.
Yeah.
So I think, what I tell people is the same thing that what we were taught as therapists, is that you have to be self-aware and honest, right? So if you experience it and you know that that's triggering, right, you have to know that going in that moment that, okay, this may trigger me, right? And that may be in those moments where if we can't avoid it and we know that may be causing a problem, then if it's possible that they can work with someone else, right? Because you have to think, like, I can't do you, if I know, right, that this is triggering for me, then there may be a possibility, man, I may not be able to be the most effective in this because I'm dealing from a place of trauma right now, right? Which means I'm dealing maybe from a place of reactivity, emotional, right? So being willing to be honest with yourself and even have that conversation with your supervisor and seeing if there's a way they can support you in that. I think if it's not avoidable, right, is still knowing that that's a trigger for you, but then how are you going to manage that? Come up with a plan about how you're going to deal with that when it's over, right? So that you don't take that home with you and live in it. And so that may be, hey, as soon as I live here, man, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to do some level of exercising. I'm going to do something that I enjoy doing. Or I may have a colleague or a friend that I can talk to and kind of process it. Because that's what, as therapists, is what we call it. We, have a processing session. And I call other therapists sometimes that I'm talking, that I have, and I'm like, man, I'm experiencing this, man. Have you ever experienced this before, man? And then they help me go through, man, well, what are you feeling in that moment, man? And ask yourself, like, why? Right? And then sometimes just having that conversation with somebody that from a non-biased position that's willing to hear you and have that conversation, I think that's good. So being able to have a plan in place, right, for when you do know, but if it becomes a part where it's triggering you to where you start to kind of, I won't say steamroll, but snowball, right, into like depression or other things, then that may be worth having a conversation with your supervisor. And then again, that culture, right, of support, of saying like, hey, I noticed that when I'm dealing with these folks, I tend to get triggered. Is there a way that I can be better, like, not say better, but be supported to where, that maybe I don't work with these particular clients because I can't really give to you, right, if I'm not effective, right? It will be like if I know that, it would be like as a therapist, if the person has confided in me that they're racist and, that they often say a lot of racist things, I don't know if I'd be able to work with them, right? Because that may trigger me, or I may feel like, man, am I giving them the advice that's really best for them, or is it coming from a place of anger and resentment or hurt, right? And I think that's where, as adults and as professionals, regardless of our credentials, we have to be able to have that conversation and talk to ourselves and say that that's okay, because I often tell people, man, you're human, you're not superhuman. Right? Yeah. But you have to be honest with yourself, right? And I get it, culturally, we tend to reward people. I think, I teach a class around policy analysis, and a book we're reading is Upward Thinking. And it's literally how to be proactive, but it also, we live in a society where we often reward reactivity to things, even though we know it's more cost effective, even though we know it's better for morale, that we address things from a more proactive standpoint. So.
When I do address my supervisor about something, unfortunately, I work in harm reduction. That is my job. So, for me right now, that's my livelihood. So I'm trying to find ways to cope. And so one of the things that it's helped me that she said, and I also see a therapist as well, but I have to realize that I can only do so much.
Yes.
And that's what I try to lean into so that I don't spiral. And again, going back to working in a system that's not meant for you anyway, especially if you're marginalized, if you're black, if you're poor, if you're under the our beautiful colors of the rainbow, whatever that might be. So I try to, like one day I had an individual come in and he was definitely suffering from mental health issues, and he was barefooted. And one of the doctors that works with us on the team had passed away, so we all were allowed to go view his body, so I dressed appropriately for that. And I brought tennis shoes to wear after I got back. But I took my tennis shoes and gave to this gentleman and put my heels back on and struggled to work the rest of the day. But that's the urges that I feel of trying to make a difference. But I'm really, like I said, trying to lean into just realizing there's only so much I can do. And I try to figure out where I can refer them to, which is really sad for me because there's no places for females in Louisville, no safe places.
Yeah. No.
And I've dealt with that at the job prior to that. There's more geared around for men, but nothing for females. And that frustrates me.
Yeah.
But just, I guess, coming to acceptance with it and realize there's only so much I can do.
Yeah. And I do think that it's good that you sound like you're talking to a therapist, because and it sounds like you're going to be in situations that are unavoidable, right? You're going to have to encounter those. I often tell people, man, there's a couple of things you can do. Sometimes having a checklist, right? I often tell people, have a checklist and then write out what has to be done today, what can be done tomorrow or later on down the week, right? Because if you don't have it written down for those visuals, literally everything is going to seem like a priority. And it, you know, and there's a saying, right? If everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority, right? So asking like, okay, what do I need to do today? What can be held off and done tomorrow, and what can be held off and done by the end of the week? And it does a couple of things that helps keep things in perspective, because if you see it all at once, you think about it, it can make you feel overwhelmed, right? And it's like, man, and then when you, that overwhelmed feeling, man, causes you to feel stuck. So then you almost feel like you're kind of running in place, like you're doing a lot of stuff, but you're not going anywhere, right? So having that list and checking those things off actually helps, because then you see the visual of the progress that you're making, right? So you can try that. I also think too, recognizing the levels of when you're going to get there, right? Just like I tell people, there's different levels of anger, right? There's a level 5, a 6, or a 7. What can we do at that stage to keep it from going to a 10, right? So you said in the moments when you experience that, man, it can kind of steam or snowball into like depression or other things. Okay, how do we catch it at a level 5 or a level 6 before it gets there? What does that look like for you? How does that show up for you mentally? How does that show up for you physically, right? And then when you recognize that, what can you do in those moments to keep it from going to a 10? Right. So, but that, I think it's good that you're talking to a therapist about that. And you are right, man. I mean, you know, resources are becoming more and more limited. I mean, you know, that's one of the things we're running into now about housing. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm hearing that, you know, they're getting rid of Section 8 vouchers, and I'm hearing they're not. And then, like you said, there's just not a lot of real estate out there, because we serve a very large, from my understanding, homeless population here, and a lot of resources are first come, first serve. And oftentimes, man, that means people who may be in crisis mode, the things that pop up may get overlooked because of that. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
So in closing, I'm gonna ask a question and then just restate how people can get in touch with you if needed. But the last in closing question is, what gives you hope when working in this field? And at the answer that, you can just close us out with your contact information stuff.
I will say, man, I think the biggest thing that gives me hope is this younger generation. I think, man, that they are waking up and they're starting to see the importance of mental health. In particular, I like, having a conversation with a friend. I'm seeing more and more black women getting their mental health together and realizing it. And I'm starting to see more men too, because women oftentimes, and this is something that we think about, we don't think about from an Afrocentric standpoint, is that black women tend to lead in a lot of those cases, right? It's like if we have more black women coming on and acknowledging their mental health and getting their mental health together, then that tends to be the men kind of follow afterwards, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's great, man. That gives me hope. It gives me hope, man, that I'm seeing more and more families that are actually working to break generational curses, right? Yeah. And that we're starting to, what I'm seeing, man, is more of a normalization of therapy. And that's what gives me hope, is that I'm seeing more and more like places like this, right? Like this would be unheard of if I was 15 or 16, right? Yeah. And I often think about that when I see kids now. I'm like, man, it's great, man, that they have therapists in all the schools. Yeah. Because I think about the things that I went through, and I'm like, man, who knows what things would have looked like if there was just somebody that said, man, that little angry, curly-haired boy that gets mad and fight all the time, man, let me have a conversation with him and just talk through it, instead of calling mom, getting punished, things like that. And so I see it coming. It's just very slow, and that's what gives me hope, man. And I think, man, it gives me hope, man, just knowing that, looking on my past circumstances and the things I was able to overcome, and, being able to provide those same experiences for the kids and families that I work with, man, give me that hope as well. But you can reach me, man, at, my contact info, 502-681-8996, or you can email me at jose@titanscounselinglou.com. And you can also go onto our website. It's titancounselinglou.com.
Yes. Thank you again so much for coming out again. I know I'm going to bring you back. You are family to us. Thanks those who joined in person, those on the live. It was a great discussion. I don't think people have asked this many questions before. So I'm glad we getting that, because that's what we want. We don't want just, it's here for everyone to kind of be part of the discussion. So I'm glad we headed that way. I will close out in prayer. I know media is trying to get out of here. But since I didn't open in prayer, I will close out in prayer, right? Father God, we just want to tell you thank you. Thank you for this discussion. Thank you for those who will be joining, those who may be joining later. God, we ask that you will cover mind, body, and soul. God, that hopefully something was said today that will spark something new, that they can see that's nothing wrong, no shame, and no guilt, but healing shall take place. God, we just want to thank you for being who you are, because you are such a good God. And we just want to tell you thank you. Amen and amen. And we just hope that this week that you set some things on fire. May you have a blessed week and see you all next week. Amen.